Hello, I'm Ella Skartzwood, and for the past 15 years, I've been working as a certified past life regression therapist. I've guided hundreds of clients through their previous incarnations, witnessing stories that range from the mundane to the extraordinary. But there's one session that has stayed with me more vividly than any other. It was with a woman I'll call Sarah, though that's not her real name. What she experienced during our session was so emotionally powerful, so heartbreakingly detailed, that I feel compelled to share it with you today. Before I begin, I want to be clear. I'm not here to convince you that reincarnation is real or that past life memories are genuine. I'm simply sharing what Sarah experienced during our session, what she saw, felt, and remembered. Whether these are true memories of a past life, symbolic representations of her subconscious, or something else entirely, I'll leave for you to decide. What I can tell you is that the emotion was absolutely real, and the details she provided were remarkably specific and consistent. Sarah came to me because she had an inexplicable fear of losing her children, even though they were healthy and thriving. This fear was consuming her life, affecting her ability to enjoy motherhood. She wondered if there might be something from a past life influencing her present-day anxiety. What emerged during our regression session was more profound and devastating than either of us anticipated. Let me share with you what Sarah remembered. I was born in the autumn of 1839, in a small village in the northern counties of England, near the Scottish border. My name was Catherine Webb. I came into this world during a time when the harvest moon hung low and orange over fields of barley that my grandfather had cultivated for 40 years. The village was called Thornwick, though I doubt you'll find it on any modern map. Perhaps 200 souls lived there, clustered around a stone church that had stood since medieval times. My father was a blacksmith, a trade he'd learned from his father before him. Our cottage stood adjacent to the smithy, and my earliest memories are filled with the sound of hammer striking anvil, the smell of hot iron, and the orange glow of the forge fire visible through the workshop door. My mother kept house and helped with the forge accounts. She could read and write, which was uncommon for women of her station in that time and place. I was the eldest of 6 children, though only 4 of us survived past infancy. My brother Thomas died when he was just 9 days old. I was 3 years old when it happened, too young to understand death, but old enough to notice the terrible silence that filled our house afterward. My mother's eyes were red for weeks. My sister Grace died at age 2 from what they called brain fever. I was 7 when Grace died, and I remember her funeral clearly. The coffin was so small. I couldn't understand why they were putting her in the ground where it was cold and dark. These early losses taught me that death was not a distant possibility but an ever-present companion. Every family in Thornwick had buried children. The graveyard behind the church was filled with small headstones, many of them weathered beyond reading. The names and dates were fading, just as the memories of those children were fading from the world. This was simply how life was. We were taught to accept it as God's will, though I remember even as a child wondering what kind of God would will such things. My mother used to say that children were like spring flowers, beautiful but fragile, here for a season and then gone. She said it with resignation, as if she'd made peace with this cruel mathematics of motherhood. But I saw how she touched the little dresses Grace had worn, how she would sometimes set an extra place at table out of habit and then stare at the empty chair with eyes that held oceans of sorrow. I learned to read from the vicar's wife, Mrs. Blackwood, who held informal lessons for village girls in the church vestry. This was considered somewhat progressive for our village and time. Many believed education was wasted on girls who would only marry and bear children. But Mrs. Blackwood had no children of her own, having lost 3 to illness, and she poured her maternal instinct into teaching us. She taught us reading, writing, basic arithmetic, scripture, and deportment. I was a quick study, hungry for the worlds that books could open. By the time I reached 15, in 1854, I was considered a young woman of marriageable age. A young man named Robert Ashford began attending our church more regularly, and I noticed him watching me during services. He was 21, the son of a sheep farmer whose land bordered the common grazing area. He had kind eyes and gentle hands, unusual for someone who spent his days doing hard physical labor. Robert courted me properly, calling at our cottage with my father's permission, walking with me to church and back under my mother's watchful eye. He was quiet and thoughtful, given to reading poetry when his work allowed, which was rare. He could quote long passages from Wordsworth and had a worn copy of Coleridge that he carried in his coat pocket. I fell in love with his mind first, then his heart. We married in the spring of 1855, just after my 16th birthday. The ceremony was simple, held in the stone church where I'd been baptized, confirmed, and educated. My mother gave me her wedding dress, altered to fit my smaller frame. Robert's father gave us 10 acres of land on the far side of his property, and Robert built us a cottage there with his own hands, with help from the men of the village. It was traditional for everyone to contribute labor to a young couple's first home. The cottage had 3 rooms downstairs and a sleeping loft above. Robert made the furniture himself, rough but sturdy. I sewed curtains from fabric my mother had been saving, planted a kitchen garden, learned to manage a household. I was young and filled with hope. I believed that love and hard work could protect us from the sorrows that had touched so many families. I know now how naive that belief was. Our first child was born in February of 1856. A daughter. We named her Margaret, after Robert's mother who had died the year before. The birth was long and difficult, nearly 24 hours of labor that left me weak and trembling. The midwife, old Mrs. Harrow, had delivered half the babies in Thornwick for the past 30 years. She knew her trade well, and both Margaret and I survived, though Mrs. Harrow told my mother privately that I'd had a harder time than most first-time mothers. When they placed Margaret in my arms, I felt a love so fierce and overwhelming that it frightened me. I had not known it was possible to love another human being with such intensity. Looking at her tiny face, her fingers that gripped mine instinctively, I felt as though my heart had left my body and was now lying vulnerable in my arms. I would have done anything for her. Died for her. Killed for her. The ferocity of maternal love shocked me. Margaret was a healthy baby, strong-lunged and vigorous. She nursed well and grew steadily. She had Robert's dark hair and my green eyes, or so everyone said. I spent hours watching her sleep, memorizing every detail of her face, marveling at the miracle of her existence. Those early months were exhausting but joyful. I was so young, barely 17, and I truly believed that if I was vigilant enough, careful enough, faithful enough in my prayers, nothing bad would happen to her. When Margaret was 18 months old, in the late summer of 1857, she developed what seemed like a simple summer cold. A runny nose, some fussiness, nothing alarming at first. Children were always getting minor illnesses. But within 36 hours, she developed a high fever. Her breathing became labored. A horrible cough developed, a distinctive barking sound that I can still hear in my nightmares all these years later. I sent Robert running for the doctor, Dr. Winters, who served 3 villages and was often difficult to find. By the time he arrived, Margaret's fever was dangerously high. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge. The cough had worsened. Dr. Winters examined her and pronounced it croup, likely complicated by pneumonia. He was frank with us. Children Margaret's age often did not survive such cases. He could offer little beyond keeping her comfortable and attempting to reduce the fever. We tried everything. Steam inhalations, cold compresses, every folk remedy anyone could suggest. My mother came and stayed with us. Robert's father brought herbs from a woman in the next village who was known for healing knowledge. We prayed without ceasing. I held Margaret for hours, rocking her, singing to her, begging God to spare her life. She died on the 4th day of her illness. I was holding her when it happened. Her breathing, which had been so labored and desperate, simply stopped. One moment she was struggling for each breath, and the next there was silence. Complete, terrible silence. I didn't understand immediately what had happened. I kept rocking her, kept singing, trying to wake her. It was my mother who gently took her from my arms and told me that Margaret was gone. I have only fragments of memory from the hours that followed. I'm told I screamed until I lost my voice. I'm told they had to forcibly separate me from Margaret's body to prepare it for burial. I remember nothing clearly until the funeral, standing in the graveyard behind the church, watching them lower that impossibly small coffin into the ground. Margaret was 18 months old. I was 17. The grief was like drowning. Like being buried alive. A physical pain in my chest so severe I couldn't breathe properly for weeks. I couldn't eat. Couldn't sleep. Would wake reaching for her in the night, forgetting for one merciful moment that she was dead, and then remembering would be like experiencing her death again for the first time. People tried to comfort me with platitudes. She's with God now. She's no longer suffering. You're young, you'll have more children. God needed another angel. Every word felt like a slap. I didn't want her to be with God. I wanted her here with me. I didn't want more children. I wanted Margaret. And the idea that God needed my baby more than I did filled me with rage that I had to keep hidden because expressing anger at God was considered sinful. My faith, which had been unquestioning my entire life, cracked like ice under pressure. I still went through the motions, attending church, saying prayers, reading scripture. But the words felt hollow. If God was all-powerful and all-loving, why did he allow children to suffer and die? Why had he given me this child only to take her away before she could even learn to speak in full sentences? Life on a farm doesn't stop for grief. The sheep needed tending. The crops needed harvesting. The household needed managing. I resumed my duties mechanically, moving through each day like a ghost. Robert grieved as well, but differently. Men in that era were not encouraged to show emotion. He worked longer hours, exhausting himself with physical labor. We barely spoke to each other for months. We were both drowning, and neither of us could save the other. In the spring of 1858, I discovered I was expecting another child. I felt no joy, only terror. I could not survive losing another child. I knew that with absolute certainty. But there was no choice. I was pregnant, and I would bear this child, and I would have to find some way to endure whatever came. A son was born in December of 1858. We named him James. The birth was easier than Margaret's had been, and James appeared healthy. But I couldn't allow myself to love him the way I'd loved Margaret. I kept myself emotionally distant, performing all the necessary tasks of caring for him but guarding my heart. If I didn't love him too deeply, perhaps his death wouldn't destroy me completely. James survived infancy. Survived his first year. By the time he was 2, I began to hope that perhaps he might live. And with that hope came the love I'd been suppressing. He was a cheerful child, always laughing, fascinated by everything around him. He followed his father everywhere, wanting to help with every task. He had Robert's gentle nature and my curiosity. I allowed myself to believe that perhaps God had relented, that perhaps this child would be spared. When James was 3 and I was 21, I gave birth to twin daughters. We named them Eleanor and Rose. 2 babies at once felt like both a blessing and a doubling of my fear. The work was overwhelming, caring for a 3-year-old and infant twins, but I was also grateful. 3 living children felt like abundance after losing Margaret. The daily work of caring for 3 small children in rural England in the 1860s was relentless beyond what modern people can imagine. Every task required enormous time and physical effort. Washing meant heating water over the fire, scrubbing everything by hand, wringing, hanging to dry. With 3 children, the washing never ended. James was constantly muddy from helping his father with the sheep. The babies soiled their linen constantly. Cooking 3 meals daily for a family of 5 required hours of labor. I baked bread twice weekly, churned butter, preserved vegetables, made cheese, tended the kitchen garden, fed the chickens, collected eggs. I made all our clothing by hand. Every shirt, every dress, every pair of small trousers was cut and sewn by me. When garments wore out, I mended them repeatedly before finally using the fabric for quilts or cleaning rags. Nothing could be wasted. The children themselves consumed whatever time remained. Infants needed nursing throughout day and night. I don't think I slept more than 2 or 3 hours at a stretch during the years I had nursing babies. Toddlers required constant watching. There were so many dangers. Wells, fires, sharp tools, wandering sheep, the river that ran behind our property. I lived in constant anxiety that one of them would be injured or killed in an accident. People speak of the past as simpler times, but there was nothing simple about raising 3 small children on a sheep farm in 1860s England. Every day demanded more labor than I could accomplish. I was always behind, always exhausted, always aware that I was failing to do everything that needed doing. And beneath everything was the fear, the knowledge that any of these children could be taken from me as Margaret had been taken. The winter of 1862 was brutal. Snow came in November and stayed through March. We were isolated for weeks at a time, unable to reach the village. The children developed colds repeatedly, but these seemed minor. Coughing, runny noses, nothing alarming. I treated them with steam, honey, warm compresses, kept them bundled and well-fed. In late February, both Rose and Eleanor developed what appeared to be another ordinary cold. Eleanor recovered within days, but Rose worsened. High fever, terrible sore throat. When I looked at her throat by candlelight, I saw white patches coating it. My blood went cold. I'd seen those patches before, on children who died of diphtheria. We'd had an outbreak in Bournemouth the previous year that had killed 6 children. Robert rode through heavy snow to fetch Dr. Winters. The doctor confirmed it was diphtheria and told us frankly that Rose would likely die. The disease was killing children throughout the region that winter. There was no treatment beyond trying to keep her comfortable and her airway clear. He left us with almost no hope. Rose died 5 days later. The disease formed a thick membrane in her throat that slowly suffocated her. We could only watch her struggle for breath until she could draw no more air into her lungs. She was 17 months old. I had thought after Margaret that I understood what it meant to watch a child die. But each death has its own particular horror, and this one was terrible because of how much she suffered, how long it took, how helpless we were. Within 2 days of Rose's death, James fell ill with the same disease. Eleanor remained healthy, though she'd been in constant contact with her sister. I cannot explain why she was spared. Dr. Winters suggested she might have had a mild case earlier and developed immunity, but we had no way to know. James fought the disease for 7 days. He was 4 years old enough to understand he was dying, old enough to be terrified. He clung to me when he had the strength, his eyes wide with fear. Toward the end, he couldn't speak because of the membrane in his throat. But he gripped my hand with all his remaining strength. When he died, something inside me broke that has never healed. 2 children dead within 2 weeks. 2 small coffins. 2 graves in the churchyard. I was 22 years old, and I had now buried 3 of my 4 children. Only Eleanor remained. I cannot adequately describe my state of mind in the months that followed. I functioned. I cooked, cleaned, cared for Eleanor and Robert. But I was not truly present. The grief was so vast that I couldn't fully experience it. I was numb, moving through the world like a sleepwalker. I believe this numbness was necessary for survival. If I had allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I'd lost, I would have been destroyed. My mother came and stayed for months. She took over the household while I sat for hours staring at nothing. She cared for Eleanor while I existed in my fog of grief. She didn't try to comfort me with words, perhaps understanding that no words could reach me. She simply maintained the household and allowed me to exist. Gradually, over many months, I began to emerge from the numbness. When the grief finally came fully, it was worse than the numbness had been. I would wake weeping in the night. Break down without warning during ordinary tasks. The smallest reminder, a toy of James's, a dress that had belonged to Rose, something Margaret used to do that Eleanor now did, would overwhelm me completely. Robert and I became like strangers. We lived in the same house but barely spoke. We were both drowning in grief and had nothing to offer each other. Our marriage suffered terribly. We were bound together only by Eleanor and the necessities of farm life. What kept me going was Eleanor herself. She needed me. She'd watched both her siblings die within weeks of each other. She was frightened and confused, clinging to me constantly, terrified I might disappear too. Caring for her gave me a reason to continue. I couldn't collapse completely when she needed me. My faith changed fundamentally. I still believed in God's existence, but I could no longer believe He was loving or just. My prayers became expressions of anger and incomprehension rather than worship. Why? Why these children? Why such suffering? I never received answers, but the act of praying, of voicing my rage to God, provided some small release. Time passed. Seasons turned. In 1864, I gave birth to another daughter, Beatrice. I was terrified throughout the pregnancy and for years after her birth, certain I would lose her too. But she survived. In 1866, another son, Thomas. Then another daughter, Alice, in 1868. All 3 survived childhood and grew to adulthood. By the time I was 33, I had borne 7 children. 3 had died before their 5th birthday. 4 survived to adulthood. This ratio was not unusual for our time and place. Many families had lost similar numbers or more. My losses, while devastating to me personally, were statistically ordinary. I observed over the years how people's attitudes toward child death were contradictory. It was so common that it was accepted as natural, expected. Cemetery plots included spaces for small graves. Mourning customs existed but were brief. Extended mourning was considered unhealthy, even selfish. Yet every individual death was still a tragedy for the family experiencing it. I never met a mother who wasn't devastated by losing a child, no matter how many she'd buried previously. We simply learned to carry our grief quietly, to mourn in acceptable ways, to present a composed face while suffering privately. Medical understanding in my lifetime evolved slowly. When my children were young, doctors knew little about disease transmission or treatment. Most people believed diseases came from bad air or moral failing or God's judgment. Treatments were often useless or harmful. By the time my grandchildren were born, knowledge had improved. Germ theory was understood. Sanitation was recognized as important. Some vaccines existed, though not for diphtheria or croup. The knowledge that my children might have been saved if they'd been born 30 or 40 years later torments me. Antitoxin for diphtheria became available in the 1890s. Better sanitation might have prevented infections. They died because they were born too soon, before medical science advanced enough to save them. They were unlucky in their timing. As my surviving children grew, I struggled to balance love with the terror of attachment. I wanted to cherish every moment with them, knowing how quickly they could be taken. But I also found myself holding back emotionally, afraid to love them too completely. This contradiction tormented me. The dead children remained constantly present in my mind. I thought of them daily. I wondered who they might have become. Margaret would have been a young woman by the 1870s. James would have been helping his father with the farm. Rose would have been learning to read and sew. These ghost versions of my dead children populated my imagination alongside my living children. I rarely spoke of them. It was considered morbid to dwell on the dead. But I carried them always, a weight that never lifted even as new joys arrived. The world changed dramatically during my lifetime. When my children were young, we had no railroad nearby, no telegraph, no conveniences. By the time my grandchildren were born, railroads connected cities, telegraphs sent messages across distances, electricity was beginning to reach even rural areas. But some things didn't change. Children still died. Mothers still grieved. When my daughter Beatrice lost her infant son to whooping cough in 1889, I understood her anguish completely. When Alice's daughter died of scarlet fever in 1895, I held my daughter while she wept and remembered my own losses decades earlier. The specific diseases might differ, medical knowledge might improve slightly, but the pain of a mother losing a child remained exactly the same. I lived to the age of 78. I died in 1917, having outlived Robert by 3 years. We were married 62 years. Of my 7 children, 4 survived to adulthood. Eleanor lived to be 67. Beatrice was 60 when she died of influenza during the Great Pandemic. Thomas and Alice were still living when I died. I had 19 grandchildren and 26 great-grandchildren at the time of my death. When people asked how many children I had, I never knew how to answer. 7? 4? 3 who died. All statements were true, but none captured the full reality. I thought constantly about those 3 children in my final years. They'd been dead for more than 50 years, yet they remained vivid in my memory. Margaret with her green eyes. James with his cheerful spirit. Little Rose who barely had time to develop a personality before diphtheria took her. They were frozen in my mind at the ages they died. 18 months, 4 years, 17 months. What I learned through those many years is that grief doesn't end. It only changes. The sharp pain gradually becomes a dull ache. The ache becomes so familiar you almost forget it's there until something brings it back to the surface. Then you're plunged into that early grief again, raw and immediate. I also learned that we're more resilient than we believe possible. When Margaret died, I thought I'd never recover. Yet I did, partially. After losing James and Rose within weeks, I believed I was destroyed beyond repair. Yet I continued living, functioning, bearing more children. Human capacity to endure terrible suffering and continue is both remarkable and terrible. There were moments of real joy interspersed with sorrow. Watching Eleanor grow strong and capable. Teaching Beatrice to read. Thomas's wedding. Alice's first child. These moments were precious precisely because I knew how fragile happiness was. But I would never say that losing my children made me stronger or taught me valuable lessons. That's nonsense. Their deaths were simply terrible, and nothing good came from them. I would have traded everything to have them back. I would have traded my own life for theirs. There's no redemption in child loss, no silver lining, no purpose that makes it acceptable. It's simply evil that some must endure because we live in a world where children die and mothers survive them. My faith, shattered by those deaths, never fully recovered. I continued church attendance, prayer, religious observance, but more from habit than conviction. The God I believed in as a young woman disappeared when my children died. If he exists, he's either powerless to prevent suffering or indifferent to it. Either possibility makes faith difficult. Yet I didn't entirely abandon belief. I couldn't. The possibility that my dead children simply ceased to exist was too terrible to accept. I needed to believe I would see them again, that their brief lives had meaning. So I maintained a desperate faith, not in God's goodness, but in his existence and the possibility of reunion after death. It was a thin thread, but it was all I had. I tell this story so there's some record that these children existed. Margaret, James, and Rose Ashford. They lived briefly in 19th century England on a small farm near Thornwick. Their lives were unremarkable by any worldly standard. They accomplished nothing history will remember. But they were real people who existed, who were loved, who mattered to me and to their father and siblings. Their deaths weren't just statistics in child mortality records. They were individual tragedies that caused real suffering to real people. I also tell this story so people understand what motherhood meant in that era. It meant bearing many children knowing you'd likely bury some. It meant loving them fiercely while living in constant fear of their death. It meant enduring losses that threatened to destroy you and continuing because other children needed you. It meant existing in perpetual anxiety, always watching for illness signs, always aware that any fever might prove fatal. Modern women cannot fully comprehend this. They live in an age where most children survive to adulthood, where medicines exist for diseases that were death sentences in my time, where infant and child mortality have declined dramatically. They cannot imagine watching a child slowly die from diphtheria, unable to help. They cannot understand the terror of every childhood illness, the constant awareness that this cold or fever might be the one that kills. I don't say this to criticize modern women or suggest life was better in my time. It wasn't. If I could have raised my children in an era where they wouldn't have been vulnerable to deadly diseases, I would have chosen that without hesitation. But I want younger generations to understand the reality of life for women of my era. The unceasing labor. The constant losses. The grief accepted as simply part of existence. What defined my life wasn't the 4 children who survived, but the 3 who died. This seems strange, but it's true. The living children brought joy and fulfillment and meaning. But the dead children shaped who I became in fundamental ways. I was defined as much by absence as by presence, by the children who should have been there but weren't. I think about what those children missed. Margaret never learned to walk confidently or talk in sentences. She never saw her second summer or her second spring flowers. James never went to school, never learned to read well, never discovered what he might become. Rose barely had time to develop a personality before death took her. They were denied all the experiences that constitute a life, education, work, love, children of their own, old age. And I was denied the opportunity to watch them grow, to know who they would have become, to have their company in my old age. There's also the question of fairness. Why did Eleanor survive the diphtheria that killed her twin? They were identical in every way. Same parents, same home, same exposure. yet one died and one lived. I contemplated this mystery for decades and found no answer. It wasn't God's will, I reject that as morally repugnant. It wasn't because Eleanor was stronger or better or more deserving. It was simply chance, randomness, the arbitrary cruelty of disease. This randomness is perhaps hardest to accept. If there had been a reason, if they died because I'd failed somehow or because of contamination I could have prevented, then at least I could understand it, even with terrible guilt. But there was no reason. They died because diseases existed and medical knowledge was inadequate. They died because they were unlucky. As I approached my own death at 78, my body failing in multiple ways, I thought constantly about those 3 children. Would I see them again? If there's an afterlife, what form would they take? Would they be infants and toddlers as when they died? Or the adults they never became? These questions occupied my mind frequently. I hoped I would be reunited with them. I hoped death would restore what was taken, the decades of life together we were denied. I hoped that in whatever comes after, there would be opportunity to know them fully, to watch them grow somehow, to have the relationship cut short by disease. But I also feared that death is simply the end, that there's nothing beyond, that my dead children are gone forever, that my own consciousness will simply cease. If that's true, then this life with all its suffering is all we have. And that seems unbearably sad. What I know with certainty is this: I loved those 3 children with everything I had. I did my best to protect and care for them. Their deaths weren't my fault, though I tormented myself with that question many times over the decades. I carried them with me every day for more than 50 years. They were my children and they mattered, and their brief lives had value even though the world doesn't remember them. I tell this story so that someone, somewhere might know that Margaret Ashford lived 18 months in 1856 and 1857. That James Ashford lived 4 years from 1858 to 1862. That Rose Ashford lived 17 months in 1861 to 1862. They existed. They were loved. They are still mourned by their mother more than 5 decades after their deaths. That is all I have to offer them now, my memory, my continued grief, my testimony that they lived and mattered. It's such a small thing, insufficient to the magnitude of their loss, but it's all that remains within my power to give. Sarah emerged from the regression in tears, sobbing uncontrollably for nearly 20 minutes. When she finally could speak, she told me that the grief she'd experienced as Catherine felt more real than any emotion she'd ever known in her current life. The memories were vivid, complete with sensory details, emotions, and a sense of lived experience that felt entirely authentic to her. Whether Sarah truly remembered a past life as Catherine Webb, or whether her subconscious created this narrative to help her process her fears about losing her own children, I cannot say with certainty. What I can tell you is that after this session, Sarah's anxiety about her children's safety diminished significantly. Not because she stopped caring, but because she felt she understood where that fear came from. She said she felt like she'd been carrying Catherine's grief without knowing it, and that acknowledging it allowed her to finally set it down. I've thought about Catherine's story many times since that session. If it was a true past life memory, then somewhere in 19th century England, a woman named Catherine Webb loved 3 children fiercely and mourned them deeply for the rest of her long life. Her story, like the stories of millions of mothers who lost children in that era, was never recorded, never remembered beyond her immediate family. But now you know. Now someone remembers that Margaret, James, and Rose Ashford existed, that they were loved, that their brief lives mattered to someone. Even if this story came from Sarah's subconscious rather than from a genuine past life, it honors the real mothers and real children who lived and died in circumstances exactly like these. The grief was real. The love was real. And the loss was real. This is why I do this work. Not to prove or disprove reincarnation, but to witness these stories, to honor these experiences, to ensure that no suffering, whether from this life or another, goes entirely unacknowledged. Thank you for listening to Catherine's story. Thank you for bearing witness to her grief and her love. And thank you for remembering, even briefly, that Margaret, James, and Rose Ashford mattered.